This album is so quintessentially Acid Archives that they included it right on the back of the book. Hey everybody, Lance from Permanent Records here, back with another entry into the Acid Archives diary. This time around, I'm talking about one of the rawest, most unhinged, crank-fueled rock and roll records in the book, Raven's Back to Ohio Blues LP. This isn't the 80s Raven from Newcastle that you might have heard of. This is a man named Raven from Ohio that recorded one album back in 1975 without any rehearsal or any preparation whatsoever, and the result is absolutely mind-blowing. Back to Ohio Blues is an amazing album, and we'll get to it here in just a minute, but first, let me tell you about Raven himself. Raven was actually this gentleman here, Bobby Loeb. He was born in 1951 in Ohio. At some point in his 20s, he was living in Florida with a biker gang doing who knows what. Not a lot is known about that particular period of Bobby or Raven's lifetime, but what we do know is that after his stint with the biker gang, potentially doing a lot of drugs and drinking and partying and maybe even selling illicit substances, he made his way back to Ohio to record this album. Well, maybe not to record the album, but that is what he did when he got back to Ohio. In 1974, he went into the studio in Columbus known as Owl Recording Studios. Owl was started just a couple years earlier by Tom Murphy of the prog band The Load, who also released an album on the same label that this album came on, Owl Records. And that label, even though they only did a little more than a handful of releases, around 50 or so as far as I could tell, did the We album that Numero Group has reissued. They also put out the One St. Stephen album that is very highly rated and regarded in the Acid Archives. And also on Owl is a single that we comped on Brown Acid by a band called Lance, my name too. Track is called Maryland. That's an amazing proto-metal single, and it also came out of the same studio that the Raven album did. And so Raven had songs. He did not have a band. The band that plays on this particular album had never played together before. They had not rehearsed, and the band members are still anonymous to this day. There's no documentation on who played on the record. No one seems to remember who was in the studio with Raven, but we do know that they didn't know what they were getting into when they entered the studio, and they just winged it, which is one of the parts of this album that makes it so amazing. Raven had concepts for songs. Obviously, there's 5 pretty long jams on the LP. One is the titular track, Back to Ohio Blues, that's over 13 minutes long, as you can see here. And my particular favorite is the Raven Mad Jam, that's a little over 8 minutes long. Even though this album is called Back to Ohio Blues, this is not a blues album. At best, it is a blues-based hard rock album, and that's as close as it gets to the blues, really. There are blues elements, but this is a proto-punk hard rock album from 1975, and it is stunning. The band, unbelievably for not having rehearsed, is pretty tight, especially the rhythm section, and the vibe of each track is generally the same. You get a groovy riff just kind of repeating over and over. You get Raven's vocals just kind of blurted out in a really like snotty kind of proto-punky manner. Lyrics about sex, drugs, more sex, more drugs, and that's about it, really. Lyrically, it's not super complex. A lot of the album is instrumental, and the guitar playing is absolutely insane. The leads are unbelievable, and there's even an incredible drum solo on the Raven Mad Jam that goes on for quite a while. Not much more is known about the recording of the album. There have been too many brain cells lost. Everyone in the studio was toasted by Raven's own recollection. He himself was on pretty much every drug known to man during the recording of this album and during this time period. But the album did get released in 1975 in an edition of 300 copies. Raven did not sell these records, however. Obviously, he didn't have a functional band, so they weren't playing shows or anything like that. So he gave all the albums away to friends, family, friends of friends, anybody who was interested at all in taking one, and maybe even some people who weren't interested in them. And he, just kind of disappeared. He left Ohio and moved to the West Coast. At some point after moving to the West Coast, he joined the military and spent a number of years in Germany before ultimately coming back to Ohio again. In the interim, after 1975 and the album's been released and kind of distributed to friends, etc., the record collecting world and the people involved in writing the reviews that are included in Acid Archives and other serious record collectors started paying a lot more attention to privately pressed albums starting in the early 80s. Those record collectors started focusing their efforts on obscure and privately pressed albums, and that's when this album was discovered by collectors, and it was bootlegged, unfortunately, back in the early 90s, and that's how word about the Raven album got out there. Thankfully, after being only available as a bootleg for many years, in 2006 or so, Raven's brother-in-law, after hearing that the album was rare, decided to take a copy that he had and put it up on eBay. It went for well over $1,000, and that led to people talking about how it might be time for a fully authorized reissue of the album, and that is what they used the proceeds of the sale of the original to do. Raven and his brother-in-law reissued the album with new artwork featuring a very dapper, suited-up Raven, a contemporary photo of him playing an acoustic guitar on the cover instead of the original artwork, and Raven hand-signed each one of those copies, and they sold through that pressing of the record. Then, in 2021, I came along and got permission to reissue this album for Record Store Day. We sold through that pressing of 1,000 copies on Back to Ohio blue splatter colored vinyl, and we let the record sit dormant for a little while until just recently when we got authorization to reissue the album again, this time on crystal clear colored vinyl, exclusively available from Permanent Records. So if you've ever wondered what the rawest George Thorogood demo sounds like, or what Stevie Ray Vaughan might have sounded like without any rehearsal whatsoever, if you're into what I like to call wasted biker rock, then you have to check out the Raven Back to Ohio Blues album. It'll blow your mind in a way that only the other private pressed albums like Steve David Heitkotter, Circuit Rider, and George Brigman's Jungle Rock will. It's absolutely insane, unhinged, raw, but beautifully comforting and familiar in a strange way. It's like classic rock from a bizarro world or an alternate universe. It's got every element of a classic all-American rock and roll album. It's just a little off-kilter in the most endearing possible way. That's what I love about private pressings. That's what I love about the Acid Archives. And that's what I find to be so interesting about albums like this one. It's just unbelievable that it exists, and I'm so happy to be able to share this information with you and share the music with you on all the digital streaming platforms now and on crystal clear limited edition colored vinyl via permanentrecordsla.com.
Sure feels good. Come on, let's make some more love.